A civilization can vanish in two different ways. First, its walls fall, its harbours fill with silt, and its people become bones beneath ordinary earth. Then, much later, its name can survive without its streets, without its houses, without any living witness. That is the coldest loss in history. Not disappearance itself, but the moment when memory outlives proof. So if Atlantis was not simply a lost city waiting under the sea, what is the real story of Atlantis, and where did the legend come from? Atlantis does not first appear as a broken wall under the sea, or as a buried harbour waiting for divers, or as a forgotten island marked on an ancient map. Its first secure appearance is much quieter. It begins in words, in two dialogues written by Plato, an Athenian philosopher who lived in the 4th century before the Common Era. That fact matters more than it may seem. Before anyone searches the ocean floor, before anyone imagines towers sinking beneath waves, the story has already passed through a human mind, a literary form, and a moral argument. Plato did not introduce Atlantis as a simple travel report. He placed it inside a conversation about cities, justice, power, memory, and the fragile order that human beings try to build around themselves. The island, if we read carefully, is not only a place, it is also a test. It asks what happens when a society becomes strong enough to forget its limits. This is why the real beginning of Atlantis is not blue water. It is not coral, stone, or sand. It is the ancient human habit of using stories to hold fears that ordinary speech cannot easily carry. Long before modern history separated evidence from legend with strict tools, human communities kept memory in layered forms. A tale could preserve a name, a warning, a political lesson, and an echo of disaster all at once. Atlantis belongs to that older world of remembering. In Plato's telling, the story is said to have passed from Egypt to Solon, and then through family memory before reaching the speakers in his dialogue. Modern scholars treat that chain with caution, because it is embedded in Plato's writing rather than confirmed by independent evidence. Still, the shape of that chain reveals something important. Atlantis is presented as memory travelling across generations, crossing languages, and becoming less like a location than a message. That message is not gentle. A powerful island empire grows wealthy, commands the sea, and then falls after turning away from balance and restraint. For a sleep audio, it may be tempting to drift quickly toward the image of a drowned city, because water is quiet and ruins are beautiful in the dark. But the honest path begins earlier, at the point where a legend becomes readable. Plato's Athens had known war, political upheaval, and the danger of imperial ambition. His listeners did not live in a world where the sea was just scenery. The sea carried trade, armies, news, hunger, wealth, and fear. A city that ruled the sea could seem almost larger than human life, yet still remain vulnerable to time, judgment, and natural force. In that setting, Atlantis becomes a mirror held near the origins of political memory. It is not about the beginning of Homo sapiens as a species, but it is deeply connected to the beginning of humans as storytellers who try to explain why great things fall. When people ask where Atlantis was, they often begin with geography. But the safer and more useful question is older. Why did this story need to be told in the first place? That question does not drain the mystery. It makes the mystery more honest. A real place leaves pottery, bones, walls, layers of ash, and traces that can be checked. A powerful legend leaves patterns in thought. Atlantis has certainly left the second kind of trace, across many later centuries, and perhaps that is why it has survived so long. It offers the image of a society that seemed secure, organized, rich, and permanent, yet still became a warning. Plato's words do not allow us to point confidently to one lost island and say, "Here it was." But they do allow us to see where the legend begins, not in a secret ocean map, but in the human need to remember power, loss, and the uneasy border between history and meaning. To understand Atlantis honestly, it helps to let go of the modern wish for a single, clean label. Plato was not writing like a field archaeologist, and he was not writing like a sailor bringing home a report from a coast he had measured. He was writing dialogue, a form where ideas move through voices, memories, claims, doubts, and examples. In that setting, Atlantis appears beside questions about the ideal city and the danger of disorder. Its function is not simply to decorate the conversation with wonder. It gives shape to a problem that ancient people knew very well. How can a society become powerful without becoming blind to itself? This is why the story carries a moral weight from its first appearance. The island is described as wealthy, organized, fertile, and strong at sea, yet its strength is not treated as proof of wisdom. It becomes the ground on which Plato can think about decline. For listeners seeking the real story, that is a crucial beginning. Atlantis enters the record not as a neutral object, but as a warning carried through narrative. A map tells us where to go, a warning tells us what to notice. Plato's Atlantis belongs much closer to the second kind of speech. In the older Mediterranean world, stories often stood between memory and instruction. They could hold traces of storms, wars, migrations, ruined towns, and forgotten rulers, but they could also reshape those traces so that later generations could understand them. Human beings have done this since the earliest communities gathered around shared danger and repeated what mattered for survival. Where water could rise, where strangers might arrive, where pride could bring ruin, where ancestors once failed. Atlantis is not evidence of those earliest moments of human life, but it belongs to the same human capacity that grew from them. Our species became different not only because hands made tools or feet crossed landscapes, but because memory could be arranged into stories that outlived the bodies that first carried it. In Plato's hands, Atlantis is a story about a society losing its inner measure. It is grand, but the grandeur is unstable. Wealth gathers, power expands, and the sea becomes a road for ambition. Then the same world that seemed to serve the island becomes the space through which it is judged, threatened, and finally removed from ordinary sight. That does not mean the story is false in a simple way. It means its truth must be handled carefully. A political tale can still draw from real fears. A philosophical example can still echo events that people in the ancient world knew. Earthquakes, floods, wars between sea powers, and the sudden weakness of cities that once looked permanent. The danger begins when a reader takes every detail as if it were a buried inventory. Plato gives rings of land and water, kings, temples, armies, and measurements, but these details work inside a crafted account. Ancient writers often use precision to create seriousness, not always to record a surveyed fact. A number in an old text is not automatically a coordinate. A description of wealth is not automatically an excavation report. The careful reader must ask what the detail is doing, not only what it seems to describe. Seen this way, Atlantis becomes less like a missing address and more like a pressure point in cultural memory. It asks why humans are so unsettled by the fall of large societies. It asks why a place that may never be found can still feel familiar. It asks why the sea, which feeds trade and contact, also becomes the perfect image for erasure. Most of all, it returns us to the origin of the legend itself. A philosopher using an old-sounding story to examine power, loss, and the fragile border between what people remember and what they need a story to mean, when certainty cannot be reached. Before Atlantis can be treated as a mystery of lost land, it has to be treated as a mystery of telling. That shift is small, but it changes everything. The usual question asks where Atlantis was, as if the legend were a damaged signpost pointing toward one hidden coordinate. The more careful question asks who needed the story, who shaped it, who received it, and why its meaning survived after its supposed geography became uncertain. In Plato's dialogues, Atlantis is not placed before us in the calm language of a survey. It comes through reported memory. One speaker says that another man heard it from Solon, who had heard it from Egyptian priests. Whether that chain is literal history is not something we can confirm from independent evidence, and it should not be repeated as proven fact. But as a literary structure, it is deeply revealing. The story is made to feel old. It is made to feel distant. It carries the atmosphere of knowledge preserved across time, from one civilization to another, from temple record to family memory, from public history to private speech. That is how many old stories gain authority. They do not begin by offering proof in the modern sense. They begin by placing the listener in the presence of age. For human beings, age itself has always had power. Long before written archives, people depended on memory carried by elders, repeated around fires, in settlements, at ritual spaces, along coasts and river valleys where survival depended on remembering what had happened before. A flood, a failed harvest, a dangerous shore, a fallen ruler, a season of hunger. These could become stories, because stories were one of the earliest tools for keeping the past useful. Atlantis belongs to this larger human pattern. Even though its known written form is Greek and philosophical, it asks us to notice how memory changes when it travels. A place can become an example, a disaster can become a lesson, a warning can take the shape of an island. This does not mean that every legend hides a complete historical event. It means that legends often grow at the meeting point between experience and imagination, where human communities try to preserve meaning after details are already slipping away. In the case of Atlantis, the danger of asking only where is that the question can force the story into a shape it may not have had. It can make every circular harbour, every submerged ruin, every ruined palace, and every old shoreline seem like a possible answer. That is how a cautious historical problem becomes an endless hunt. The world is full of coasts that changed, cities that declined, and lands that were damaged by earthquakes or the sea. The Mediterranean alone contains enough real instability to feed many memories of loss. But similarity is not proof. A real earthquake does not automatically become Atlantis. A wealthy island culture does not automatically become Atlantis. A drowned ruin does not automatically become Atlantis. The honest approach begins with the text, then moves outward slowly. What was Plato doing with this account? What fear did it organize? What did its first audience hear when they heard of a rich sea power destroyed after moral decline? These questions keep the legend connected to its true beginning. They also bring it back to something older than Plato, the human need to understand why what seems strong can still disappear. From the earliest roots of human community, people have lived with the knowledge that shelter, kinship, food, and memory are never completely secure. A society may build walls, laws, ships, temples, and stories, but none of these can fully escape time. Atlantis gives that recognition a dramatic body. It lets loss become visible without making it simple. So the first doorway into the real story is not a diving expedition. It is a listening posture. We listen to the way the legend was framed, the way authority was borrowed from age, the way fear of power was folded into geography, and the way a possible memory became something larger than memory. Only then can the question of Atlantis remain open without becoming careless. To understand why Atlantis could be born in Plato's world, we have to enter a culture where myth and history did not yet live in separate rooms. Ancient Greek thinkers could reason carefully, argue sharply, and question inherited stories, yet they still moved through a landscape filled with gods, heroes, ancestral memories, sacred places, and old disasters whose edges were never completely clear. A story could be more than entertainment. It could be a vessel for political thought, a warning about pride, a memory of danger, and a way to compare one city with another. This does not mean the Greeks believed every tale in the same simple way. Many writers questioned old traditions. Many listeners understood that stories could teach without being literal records. But the border between remembered event and meaningful tale was softer than it is for us now. Atlantis grew from that softer border. It entered a world where people were already used to hearing about cities punished, kings tested, seas crossed, lands broken, and human order shaken by forces larger than any ruler. For Plato's audience, the sea was not a distant blue surface on a map. It was the road of merchants, soldiers, colonists, sailors, grain ships, and rumour. It connected cities, but it also exposed them. A storm could break a voyage. A war fleet could appear from beyond the horizon. A trading power could rise quickly, then weaken when alliances, food supplies, or harbours changed. This living fear of the sea gave Atlantis emotional weight. It made the idea of a rich island empire both impressive and uneasy. The legend did not come from nowhere. It came from a human world that had learned, over many generations, that power gathered near water could also be lost near water. That pattern reaches deeper than Greece. Since the earliest human communities, people have depended on remembering landscapes that could feed them and threaten them at the same time. Rivers brought fertile ground, then flooding. Coasts brought fish and contact, then storms. Open routes brought exchange, then invasion. The human mind learned to connect, place with risk, and risk with story. Atlantis belongs to this old mental habit, turning geography into memory and memory into warning. In Plato's setting, this habit met philosophy. He was not simply repeating a fireside tale. He was using the authority of an ancient-sounding account to think about cities, justice, and decline. The Greeks already had stories of floods and destroyed generations. They had poems about heroes whose strength did not save them from fate. They had memories of war between Greek cities, of political breakdown, and of the dangerous attraction of empire. Atlantis could gather these concerns into one image. A great island outside the familiar center of Greek life becomes a stage where wealth, order, military reach, and moral failure can be seen together. This is why the story feels larger than one ruined city. It carries the scale of history while still working like a lesson. But a lesson is not the same as a lie. Human cultures often teach through shaped memory. A tale may simplify, enlarge, and arrange experience, yet still preserve something true about fear, ambition, and loss. The honest reader does not have to choose between calling Atlantis pure invention or treating it as a buried news report. A slower reading allows it to stand where it first stood, between memory and argument. From that position, its origin becomes clearer. Atlantis came from a world where old stories still helped people think, where disaster could become moral language, and where the fall of a powerful society could be imagined as both a historical possibility and a warning about the human condition. In the ancient Mediterranean, stories about floods, broken cities, divine anger, wandering heroes, and vanished generations were not separate from the way people thought about real life. They were one tool a community used when direct explanation was too small for the event being remembered. A storm could destroy ships, but a story could make the storm mean something. A city could lose a war, but a story could turn that defeat into a warning about pride, judgment, or the limits of human control. Atlantis belongs to this older habit of thought. It is not simply placed in the world as a strange island. It is placed in a web of meanings that Plato's listeners would have understood. Wealth may grow too fast, sea power may become dangerous, and a society may look orderly while carrying decline within it. For ancient Greeks, the gods, the past, and political life often touched each other in narrative. A tale about a punished ruler was also a way to think about law. A tale about a flood was also a way to think about memory after disaster. A tale about a destroyed city was also a way to ask what makes a human community last. This is close to one of the oldest functions of storytelling in our species. Long before written philosophy, human beings had to remember what could not be learned safely twice. A dangerous river bend, a coast where storms rose quickly, a place where food failed, a conflict that scattered families. These experiences could be carried forward through repeated speech. The details might change, but the need remained. Stories helped human groups hold lessons beyond one lifetime. Atlantis appears much later, in a literate Greek world, yet it still draws from that deep human pattern. Plato's world gave such stories a more reflective shape. Instead of only saying that a city fell, a thinker could ask what kind of order held it together, and what happened when appetite became stronger than restraint. The legend of Atlantis gives these questions a body. It gives them harbours, rings of land and water, rulers, temples, armies, and a final removal from sight. But these images should not tempt us into treating the account like a preserved photograph. In ancient writing, vividness often served thinking. A clear image helped a listener feel the weight of an argument. Atlantis is vivid because it has work to do. It allows the fall of a society to be imagined not as a random accident, but as a pattern. Abundance, expansion, imbalance, then loss. Many old stories worked in this way. They did not simply report the world. They organized the world so people could live with it. A flood story might preserve the memory that water can overwhelm settled life. A story of a lost city might preserve the fear that human order is never final. A story of divine punishment might express what people saw when power was used without measure. The tale made the frightening event thinkable. It gave shape to vulnerability. That matters for Atlantis because the legend has often been pulled away from this original function. Modern readers may look for machinery, secret maps, or a single hidden ruin, but Plato's audience heard something tied to civic life. They heard of a rich sea empire that became morally disordered, defeated by a disciplined society, and swallowed by catastrophe. Whether any real memory lies behind the account must be approached cautiously. What can be said more safely is that the story uses familiar ancient materials to ask a familiar human question. Why do organized societies fail? That question reaches back toward the beginning of human community itself. Once people began living in groups large enough to depend on shared rules, shared food, shared defense, and shared memory, failure was no longer only personal. A broken society meant broken inheritance. Atlantis turns that fear into a distant island, and by doing so, it makes the loss calm enough to contemplate. Atlantis also reflects a fear that belonged very deeply to the Greek world, the fear that success could become a form of danger. Plato's Athens had lived through the long shadow of war, rivalry, naval ambition, and political instability. A city that trusted its ships, its money, its walls, and its cleverness could still discover that human order is not as firm as it feels from inside. This does not mean Atlantis was written as a direct copy of Athens, or as a hidden report about one known enemy. That would be too simple. But the story grows in soil where those worries were real. The Greeks knew that the sea could enrich a city and also stretch its desires beyond measure. Harbours brought grain, metal, timber, ideas, and strangers. They also brought comparison, competition, fear, and the dream of ruling what lay beyond the horizon. In that world, a sea empire was never only an economic fact. It was a moral question. How far can a city reach before its reach changes its character? Atlantis gives that question a distant body, large enough to be seen without naming the nearest wound too quickly. The island is powerful, but its power is not peaceful. It is rich, but wealth does not make it wise. It is organized, but organization does not protect it from inner decline. These tensions would have been understandable to people living among city-states that admired discipline yet feared domination. The story also belongs to a wider historical landscape, where communities remembered collapse in many forms. Palaces had fallen before Plato's time. Old powers had disappeared from ordinary life. Ruins stood in many regions as quiet evidence that earlier worlds had once felt permanent. For people without modern archaeology, such ruins could invite story. Stones did not explain themselves. A wall remaining after its builders were forgotten could become a question in the ground. Who made this? Why did they leave? What did they do wrong? Human beings have probably asked such questions since the first settled places began to outlive the people who built them. Once a community leaves durable traces, later generations must live beside evidence of vanished hands. That experience connects Atlantis to the long human relationship with time. Our species learn not only to survive the present, but to notice absence. Empty dwellings, old paths, burial places, broken tools, and inherited names whose first speakers were gone. Atlantis gathers that awareness into one grand image. It says, in effect, that even the powerful can become absent. Yet the story does more than mourn. It warns. Plato's Atlantis is connected with imbalance, with a society that moves away from moderation. In Greek thought, excess was not simply bad behavior. It was a sign that a person or city had lost its proper place within a larger order. This is why the legend carries political weight. It is not just about water swallowing land. It is about a community being unable to hold itself within limits. The catastrophe at the end gives visible form to a failure already unfolding inside the society. That pattern is important because it keeps the legend from becoming merely a search for ruins. A ruin can tell us that something ended. A story can ask what kind of life was being lived before the ending came. Atlantis survives because it speaks to both levels at once. It offers an image of external disappearance and internal disorder, of geography and conduct, of sea power and moral strain. In the calm light of a careful reading, Atlantis is not a cheap mystery. It is a way ancient people thought about the oldest human problem of shared life, how to build enough power to survive, without building so much desire that memory itself becomes a warning left behind for later minds to touch gently and to question without certainty in the long dark. When the Atlantis story is read slowly, the first thing that appears is not a single clue, but a carefully arranged world. Plato gives the island scale, wealth, order, ancestry, geography, military strength, and a dramatic ending. These details have helped the legend survive because they make Atlantis feel almost visible. Yet visibility in a story is not the same as verification in the ground. The account describes a large island power beyond the familiar centre of the Mediterranean imagination, a place connected with the sea, rich in resources, organised under rulers, and strong enough to threaten other peoples. It is not presented as a lonely village or a small coastal settlement. It is presented as an expansive society with political reach. That scale matters because Atlantis is meant to feel like more than a local disaster. It becomes an image of civilization itself, enlarged until its rise and fall can carry moral weight. The island is described with fertile land, metals, harbours, temples, royal authority, and a structured society. These are not random ornaments. They build the sense of a world that has moved far beyond simple survival. Human beings, from the earliest settled communities onward, have always attached deep meaning to such signs. Stored food, built spaces, shared rules, protected routes, and inherited authority. They show that a group has learned to organize life across seasons and generations. Atlantis, in Plato's telling, is filled with these signs of organized abundance. But abundance is not allowed to remain innocent. The richer the island becomes, the more clearly the story asks whether human beings can hold wealth without being changed by it. Sea power is central to that question. Atlantis is not merely rich on land. It reaches outward. Its strength moves across water, and water turns local power into distance. A society with ships can trade, learn, explore, and feed itself from far away. It can also invade, command, and imagine that the horizon belongs to it. In the ancient world, the sea was both path and temptation. Plato uses that double nature with great care. Atlantis is a sea power, and its danger is inseparable from that fact. It stands for the moment when movement becomes appetite, when contact becomes domination, when the ability to cross distance becomes the desire to possess what lies beyond distance. Then, the story introduces conflict. Atlantis is not destroyed in isolation. It is set against a different vision of order, associated in the dialogue with ancient Athens. The contrast is important. Atlantis is wealthy and mighty, while its opponent is framed as disciplined and restrained. Whether this contrast reflects literal history is not something we can safely claim. What matters more securely is how the contrast works inside Plato's thought. It makes Atlantis a test of civic character. It asks whether strength without measure can defeat a society imagined as more balanced. The story answers through defeat and catastrophe, but even there we must read carefully. The ending is famous because Atlantis disappears after violent natural events. Later imagination has often reduced the legend to that image, the sea closing over a lost world. But in Plato's account, the physical removal is only the final visible sign of a decline already described in moral terms. The land goes under, but the society has already lost its inner order. That is why the tale cannot be honestly reduced to a treasure map. It is a sequence: abundance, expansion, imbalance, war, and loss. Each movement makes the next feel possible. For a modern listener, the calm value of the story is not that it proves a drowned empire once weighted beyond a known strait. It is that it preserves a pattern humans have recognized again and again. A community builds, gathers memory, extends power, and begins to believe its own permanence. Then history, nature, or its own choices reveal the softness beneath that confidence. Atlantis is powerful because it lets that pattern be seen in one still image. An island that rose high in the mind, then vanished into uncertainty. The details of Atlantis can feel solid because they are arranged with such confidence. Plato names ancestry, rulers, lands, waters, temples, metals, armies, and a final disaster. A listener can almost walk through the place in the mind. That is exactly why the account must be handled with care. Vivid writing can create the feeling of contact, but feeling is not the same as evidence. A field report begins with observation that can be checked against the ground. A philosophical story begins with meaning, and then gives that meaning a shape the listener can remember. Atlantis belongs to the second path. Its rings of land and water, its royal line, its wealth, and its military reach are not useless details, but they do not automatically prove that every feature once existed exactly as described. In ancient literature, precision often served persuasion. A number could make a tale feel weighty. A place name could lend distance and age. A genealogy could give a story authority. These devices help the listener enter the account, but they do not give modern readers permission to treat the account as if it were a map drawn after excavation. This difference is important because human beings have always trusted clear images more easily than uncertain explanations. From the early roots of human storytelling, a remembered danger became stronger when it had a shape, a river that rose, a coast that failed, a path where enemies came, a settlement that hunger emptied. The mind holds images. It carries them across generations. Yet as an image travels, it can gather order, symmetry, and moral force that the first event may never have had in the same form. Atlantis may contain echoes of real ancient fears: earthquakes, floods, sea power, war, and the collapse of proud cities. Those fears were not imaginary. The Mediterranean world knew moving water, shaking ground, burned settlements, broken alliances, and the sudden weakness of places that had seemed secure. But an echo is not the original sound. Similarity between Plato's story and a later archaeological find, or a known disaster, is not enough to close the question. A volcanic island damaged by eruption is not automatically Atlantis. A palace culture with ships is not automatically Atlantis. A drowned harbour is not automatically Atlantis. To read the legend honestly, one must let the text remain what it is, a crafted account placed inside a philosophical conversation. That does not make it empty, it makes it more demanding. Its truth may lie not in literal measurement, but in the pattern it gives to human experience. A society becomes rich, its reach expands, its habits change. The sea that once connected it to the world becomes the symbol of its appetite and its disappearance. This pattern could speak to many ancient memories without being identical to any one of them. It also reaches back toward the beginning of settled human life, when groups first learned that permanence was a fragile promise. Houses could stand longer than their builders, storage could fail, graves could outlast names. Children could inherit places whose original stories were already blurred. In such a world, memory needed arrangement. It needed forms that could survive forgetting. Atlantis is one of those forms. It is too shaped to be read as a plain record, and too powerful to dismiss as meaningless decoration. Plato's account asks us to slow down at the border between evidence and imagination. There, the honest reader does not say, "This must be a hidden city," and does not say, "This has nothing to teach." The careful position is quieter. Atlantis is a story built with historical materials, moral pressure, and ancient fears. It may reflect the world that produced it, but reflection is not the same as a photograph, and a legend is not made truer by forcing it to answer as if it was stone, or by silencing what it still reveals. A story can contain a memory without being a memory in its original shape. This is one of the quietest truths behind Atlantis. Human beings do not carry the past like a sealed jar. They carry it through speech, comparison, fear, pride, loss, and the need to make events understandable. By the time a disaster becomes a tale, it may already have changed. A shoreline may become an island. A political rival may become an empire. A flood may become a judgment. A remembered collapse may become a warning about the limits of power. This does not make the tale worthless. It means the tale must be read as something alive in culture, not as a frozen document from the moment of the event. Atlantis may be useful in exactly that way. It may gather several kinds of ancient experience into one form: the fear of the sea, the memory of ruined places, the unease of growing empires, and the knowledge that human order can disappear faster than people expect. Plato's account does not need to be a direct transcript of one lost city in order to reveal a real human pattern. Many cultures remember loss through stories that are larger, cleaner, and more meaningful than ordinary life. A city destroyed by war leaves confusion. A city destroyed in a story can become an image. It can be passed down because it has shape. It can teach because it has direction. Atlantis has that kind of shape. It begins as abundance. It moves into expansion. It enters conflict. It ends in disappearance. That movement is not random. It is the shape of a warning. From the earliest roots of human community, people have had to translate danger into forms the next generation could remember. A group that survived a flood did not only need to know that water rose. It needed to remember where, when, how, and what human choices made the danger worse. A group that saw a powerful settlement abandoned did not only see empty structures, it inherited a question about why people who built so much could not keep it. These old human questions are still present inside the Atlantis legend. They are not proof of a specific place, but they help explain why the story feels familiar, even when the evidence remains uncertain. The idea of a fragment of history inside a legend must also be handled gently. It is possible for a tale to preserve a real fear without preserving a real map. It is possible for a story to echo an earthquake, a coastal flood, or a fallen sea power without naming the event that first stirred the imagination. This is why responsible reading avoids two easy mistakes. The first mistake is to treat Atlantis as proven history simply because the story is detailed. The second mistake is to treat it as empty because it cannot be pinned down with certainty. Between those positions is a more careful space. In that space, Atlantis becomes a cultural memory shaped by philosophy. Its truth is not measured only by whether divers can find its streets. Its truth also lies in what the story shows about how people remember collapse. The ancient Mediterranean had many reasons to produce such a story. Its coasts changed, its islands shook, its cities fought, its trade routes brought wealth and danger together. A person living in that world did not need fantasy to understand that the sea could both feed and erase. But Plato gave that fear a moral frame. He did not simply say that land was lost. He described a society that lost balance before it lost visibility. That order matters. The physical catastrophe comes after the ethical decline. The land disappears after the society has already become a problem. In this way, the story turns natural disaster into a language for political and moral disorder. Whether or not there was ever a single place behind it, Atlantis became a way to think about something humans have faced since organized life began. Every society depends on memory, restraint, and shared limits. Yet every society can begin to imagine that its own strength is permanent. The legend survives because it gives that danger a place to rest in the mind. It lets us look at loss without pretending to solve it too quickly. It asks us to accept that some stories may contain traces of real experience, while still refusing to become simple evidence. Atlantis may not be a door to one drowned city. It may be a doorway into the way human memory turns broken history into meaning. The Mediterranean is one of the reasons Atlantis could feel believable to ancient listeners. It is a sea surrounded by lands that have never been completely still. Its coasts curve around mountains, islands, narrow straits, deep basins, river mouths, volcanoes, and fault lines. People who lived near it did not need to imagine that the earth could change. They could see cliffs broken by time, harbours silting, shorelines shifting, islands smoking, and towns shaken by forces no ruler could command. For a modern reader, a map may make the region look fixed, as if land and sea have always agreed on the same borders. For ancient communities, the border was more alive. A harbour that brought wealth could become shallow, a coastal plain could flood. An earthquake could damage walls, temples, wells, and roads in a single day. A wave could enter a place that had seemed protected. These events did not have to erase a whole civilization to leave a deep mark on memory. Sometimes the loss of a port, a palace, a district, or a sacred site was enough to teach a lasting lesson. The ground beneath human order is not as obedient as human plans. Atlantis rises from exactly the kind of imagination such a world could nourish. This does not prove that a particular Mediterranean disaster was Atlantis. It only shows why a story about a rich sea power swallowed by catastrophe would not have sounded empty. The region gave people real experiences of instability. The sea fed them, connected them, and threatened them at the same time. This double nature reaches far back into the human story. Long before cities and written texts, people followed water because water meant food, movement, plants, animals, and contact with other groups. Rivers and coasts offered life, but they also demanded memory. A group that forgot where floods came, where cliffs fell, or where storms gathered might pay for that forgetting. In this sense, human memory grew close to unstable landscapes. It learned to attach caution to places. The Mediterranean world later turned that old habit into myths, histories, warnings, and political stories. Atlantis belongs to that long movement from lived risk into remembered meaning. The sea, in Plato's account, is not just scenery behind a lost island. It is the condition that makes the island powerful and vulnerable. Through water, Atlantis can grow outward. Through water, it can threaten others. Through water, it can disappear from sight. That is why the Mediterranean is so important for understanding where the legend came from. It was a world where the sea was never neutral. It carried grain to hungry cities, soldiers to foreign shores, merchants to new markets, and stories from one language to another. It also carried wreckage, fear, and news of places damaged by sudden force. A sailor returning from a broken harbour did not bring only information. He brought an image. A family remembering an old coastal loss did not preserve only a fact. It preserved a warning. Over generations, such memories could become wider than the events that began them. A damaged town could become a vanished place. A vanished place could become a lesson about pride. A lesson about pride could become an island empire. This is the careful way to connect Atlantis with real geography without pretending to solve it. The Mediterranean supplied the conditions for a legend of disappearance. Active earth, dangerous water, dense trade, competing cities, and old memories moving across borders. Plato shaped these materials into a philosophical story about power and decline. The sea did not merely swallow land in the tale, it swallowed confidence. It turned the human wish for permanence into something uncertain and quiet. When ancient people heard of Atlantis falling beneath disaster, they were hearing an image that their world had prepared them to understand. Collective memory often grows strongest where daily life meets repeated danger. Around the Mediterranean, the danger did not come from one source. The ground could shake. Volcanoes could darken the sky or bury settlements. Shorelines could sink, rise, or erode. Harbours that once opened easily to ships could become hard to use. A trading town could lose its advantage without being destroyed. These changes were not abstract processes to the people who lived through them. They affected food, travel, safety, trade, and the confidence that a home would still stand tomorrow. When a wall cracks after an earthquake, memory enters the body before it enters a story. People remember where they stood, what sound came first, which road broke, which well failed, which relatives could not return. Later, as witnesses die and children inherit only the account, the event becomes simpler and larger. The broken wall may become the fallen city. The damaged coast may become the swallowed land. The frightened voice may become a warning that the sea takes back what people build proudly. Atlantis fits inside this human process, though it cannot be reduced to one known disaster. The Mediterranean contained enough movement of earth and water to make sudden loss feel plausible. Earthquakes were important because they attacked the oldest human trust, the trust that the ground is beneath us. From the beginning of human life on landscapes that had to be remembered, people depended on stable places for sleep, food, fire, tools, burial, and kinship. A shaking earth breaks that deep expectation. It reminds a community that even the surface on which memory rests can move. Volcanoes added another fear. They could change light, air, soil, and settlement, sometimes violently, sometimes through long consequences after the first eruption had ended. Coastal subsidence and erosion worked more quietly, but they could be powerful in memory. A family might know that an older shoreline once lay farther out. Fishermen might speak of stones under shallow water. Traders might remember a harbour that no longer served large ships. Such observations did not need modern geology to become meaningful. They needed continuity across generations. Trade then carried these memories beyond their local origin. A merchant who visited many ports could compare damage from different shores. A sailor could hear a story in one harbour and repeat it elsewhere. A priest, poet, or thinker could receive older material and reshape it. The Mediterranean was not only a basin of water, it was a system of moving voices. Goods moved with stories. Stories moved with fear. In that movement, local losses could become part of a larger imagination of vanished places. Atlantis may have grown from this atmosphere of circulating memory, not as a neat record, but as an image ancient listeners could understand because their world had taught them that coasts, ports, and powers were never secure. This also helps explain why the legend connects natural force with moral meaning. When people face disaster, they often ask not only what happened, but why it happened to them. That question is older than written history. Early groups did not possess scientific explanations in the modern sense, but they did possess attention, pattern, and memory. They noticed seasons, animal movement, dangerous ground, changing water, and the cost of ignoring warnings. Later societies, with temples, laws, ships, and cities, carried the same need into more elaborate stories. A damaged harbour could become a lesson about pride. An earthquake could become a sign of imbalance. A lost coast could become a symbol of a lost way of living. Plato's Atlantis draws strength from this union of environment and meaning. Its fall is not just geological. It is remembered as a judgment on excess. There the legend becomes more than disaster. It becomes a meditation on how nature, trade, power, and memory conjoin until one vanished place seems to speak for many losses at once. The safest way to speak about Atlantis is to keep two truths beside each other without forcing them into one answer. First, the ancient world did know the violence of sea and earth. Coasts changed, harbours failed, islands shook, and memories of disaster could travel. Second, none of that allows us to say that Plato's Atlantis has been found, or that one ruined place must be the source of the legend. Between those truths is the ground where the story becomes most useful. Atlantis may reflect a real human fear without proving a real city. It may carry the atmosphere of coastal loss without preserving a single coastline. It may use the language of flood, earthquake, and disappearance, because those forces were familiar enough to make the warning feel true. Near the Mediterranean, the sea was a giver and a taker. It brought food, trade, contact, and wealth. But it also brought storms, shipwrecks, invasion, and the anxiety of living beside a border that never belonged to human hands. A city could build walls, docks, storehouses, temples, and roads, yet the water beyond them remained older than the city and beyond its control. That tension reaches far back into the beginning of human life near water. Early communities were drawn to water because the body needs it. Food gathers around it and movement often follows it. But the same water required memory, caution, and shared teaching. To live near water was to learn that survival depends not only on strength, but on attention. Atlantis gives that old lesson a polished form. It imagines a powerful society near the sea, expanding through the sea, then removed by forces that no power can command. That image does not need to be read as proof of one lost capital. It can be read as evidence of something more durable, the human knowledge that nature can erase the marks of ambition. In Plato's account, this fear is not left as a simple accident. It is tied to moral disorder. The island's fall is described after its character has changed, after wealth and power have drawn it away from balance. That sequence is why the story has lived so long. If Atlantis were only a place destroyed by water, it might be a disaster tale. Because it is also a tale of decline, it becomes a mirror for societies that fear their own success. The Mediterranean supplied many images for such a mirror: broken ports, abandoned settlements, tales of floods, memories of shaking ground, and the constant sight of ships leaving the known shore. But a mirror is not the thing reflected. The fact that many ancient experiences resemble pieces of the Atlantis story should make us cautious, not certain. It means the legend was built from materials that made sense in its world. It does not mean every detail must be located in stone. This is where a calm reading protects the value of the story. We do not have to strip Atlantis of meaning because it cannot be pinned to a verified site. We also do not have to invent certainty in order to keep the mystery alive. The legend can remain open, but not careless. It can teach us about how humans remember unstable places, how societies turn disaster into warning, and how the sea becomes an image for everything that escapes possession. From the earliest water edges where human groups learn to watch the ground, the sky, and the tide, to the philosophical world of Plato, one lesson remains steady. People build meaning on land that is never entirely still. Atlantis may come from that lesson more than from any single ruin. Its origin may lie in the meeting of real environmental danger, political reflection, and the long human habit of turning loss into a story that can survive after the evidence has grown quiet, and still moves through human time. The most famous modern comparison to Atlantis is the volcanic island of Thera, known today as Santorini, and the Bronze Age world connected with the Minoan civilization of Crete. The reason is easy to understand. Here we have an island world in the Aegean Sea, rich maritime culture, impressive palaces, wide trade connections, and a major volcanic eruption that left deep marks on the region. At first glance, the resemblance feels powerful. A sea-centered society, a dramatic natural catastrophe, and later memories of loss all seem to gather in one place. Yet the careful path begins with what can be said safely. Thera was a real volcanic island. In the Bronze Age, it was part of the wider Aegean world, connected by trade, art, and movement across the sea. The eruption of Thera was one of the major natural events of that ancient region, and it affected the island itself with great force. Archaeologists have found the buried settlement of Akrotiri, preserved beneath volcanic material, showing a complex community with buildings, wall paintings, storage areas, and signs of contact with other Aegean places. These are real traces, not legend. They show human life interrupted by a natural force much larger than any local plan. For a listener thinking about Atlantis, it is natural to pause here. A buried town beneath ash feels close to the imagination of a lost world. A volcanic island in the sea feels close to the language of sudden disappearance. A maritime culture connected to Crete feels close to the image of power carried over water. But closeness is not identity. The eruption at Thera does not simply equal Atlantis. It is a historical event that may help explain why later people found stories of destroyed island societies believable. The Minoan world itself was not a single mysterious empire in the way Atlantis is described. It was a Bronze Age civilization centered especially on Crete, known through palaces, art, trade, writing systems, religious imagery, and material remains. Its people lived in a world of ships, islands, agriculture, craft, exchange, and hierarchy. They were not characters in a fantasy of sudden total erasure. Their history was complex, and its decline cannot responsibly be reduced to one eruption alone. Natural disaster may have contributed to instability, but human societies usually change through many pressures together: economy, politics, trade networks, conflict, environmental stress, and the passing of generations. This caution is important because real archaeology becomes weaker when it is forced to serve a legend too quickly. Akrotiri matters because it shows a Bronze Age community in detail. Crete matters because it reveals a sophisticated island society of the ancient Aegean. Thera matters because it reminds us that the Earth itself can enter history without asking permission. These things are already meaningful. They do not need to be renamed Atlantis in order to hold value. From the beginning of human settlement near coasts and islands, people have lived with this same fragile bargain. Water makes connection possible. Volcanic soil can be fertile. Harbours can feed trade and memory. But the same landscape can change suddenly. A mountain can open. Ash can fall. The familiar sky can darken. A home can become a layer that later hands uncover in silence. This is where Thera becomes important for the real story of Atlantis, not as a solved answer, but as a real example of the kind of event that could shape ancient imagination. Plato wrote long after the Bronze Age, in a world where stories, ruins, and inherited memories had already travelled through many minds. It is possible that memories of Aegean disasters, including Thera, contributed to the atmosphere from which Atlantis drew strength. It is also possible that the resemblance is partly created by modern desire to find one clean origin. The honest reading keeps the resemblance visible, but does not close the case. Santorini gives us ash, walls, paintings, and a changed island. Atlantis gives us a philosophical legend about power, decline, and disappearance. They touch each other in the human imagination, but they are not the same thing. The Minoan world is often drawn toward Atlantis because it gives the imagination several things at once: an island setting, a maritime society, elegant built spaces, wide exchange, and a memory of disaster. These are not small resemblances. They touch the same emotional center that keeps Atlantis alive. Crete sat within a sea of movement, where ships carried goods, styles, skills, and messages between islands and coasts. Its palace centers, especially places such as Knossos, show a society able to organize labor, storage, craft, ritual life, and exchange across generations. To later eyes, such remains can feel almost like the outline of a lost power. There are painted rooms, complex buildings, administrative marks, imported materials, and signs of contact beyond one local valley. The sea is everywhere in the background, not only as water, but as a way of life. This is why people have often compared the Minoan world with Atlantis. Plato's island is rich, ordered, and connected to the sea. The Minoan world was real, rich in material culture, and deeply tied to the Aegean. The resemblance begins there, in the meeting of evidence and image, but it must remain a resemblance, not a conclusion. The Minoan palaces were not discovered as Atlantis. Their culture had its own history, language systems, religious symbols, political structures, and long development. It deserves to be understood first as itself. Still, the comparison teaches something useful about the origin of the legend. Human beings are drawn to stories when real traces appear incomplete. A palace without its full voice invites interpretation. A ruined center asks the mind to imagine the people who moved through its courts and rooms. From the earliest communities, humans learned to read marks left behind by others. Footprints, tools, hearths, graves, paths, walls. Those traces help people understand where others had lived, what they had feared, and what they had lost. Archaeology continues that ancient habit with careful methods. Atlantis, however, belongs to a less certain space, where traces and stories do not fit neatly together. The Minoan connection becomes tempting because it offers visible remains for an invisible legend. It gives stone to a story that otherwise begins in Plato's words. The eruption of Thera strengthens the temptation. A volcanic catastrophe near a sea-centered Bronze Age world seems to match the famous image of sudden destruction. Akrotiri, buried under volcanic material, gives an unusually vivid picture of life interrupted. Crete and the wider Minoan sphere show maritime skill and complex society. Taken together, these facts make the Atlantis comparison understandable. Yet responsible history asks what the comparison can and cannot carry. It can show that the Aegean knew island wealth, sea routes, and severe natural disaster. It can show that later memories of destruction could have drawn from such events. It cannot prove that Plato was describing the Minoans, or that Atlantis was a coded name for Crete, Thera, or any single Aegean place. The dates, geography, scale, and literary purpose do not line up simply. More importantly, Plato's Atlantis functions as a moral and political image. The Minoan world was a real human society, not merely an example inside a philosopher's argument. To collapse one into the other would reduce both. A calmer reading lets them stand side by side. The Minoans show how impressive a Bronze Age island culture could be. Santorini shows how violently a natural event could interrupt human life. Atlantis shows how later storytelling could turn power, beauty, fear, and disappearance into a warning about imbalance. Near the beginning of settled human life, people learn that the places that nourish society can also expose it. Islands offer protection, trade, food, identity, and beauty, but they also depend on roots, weather, harvests, and the patience of the earth. The Atlantis legend lives in that tension. The Minoan comparison matters because it reminds us that myths do not arise in empty air. They grow near real seas, real ruins, real memories, and real human losses, even when the final story is not the same as the history beneath it. The safest conclusion about Santorini, the Minoan world, and Atlantis is not a dramatic one. It is a patient one. These places and events may help explain why Plato's story felt believable, but they do not allow us to say that Atlantis has been identified. Santorini gives us a real volcanic eruption. Akrotiri gives us a real buried settlement. Crete gives us a real Bronze Age island civilization with palaces, trade, art, and long contact across the Aegean. Atlantis gives us a philosophical story about a powerful island society that expands, declines, and disappears. The overlap is meaningful, but it is not complete. The danger begins when a useful comparison becomes a fixed answer. Once people decide too early that Atlantis must be Santorini, or must be the Minoans, the legend stops being read carefully. Details that do not fit are pushed aside. Details that seem similar are made too important. A cautious possibility becomes a headline. That is not how honest history works. Real human societies are not puzzles created for later people to solve with one word. They are layered lives, made of food, work, language, trade, family, fear, ritual, and change across generations. The Minoan world was not waiting to become evidence for Atlantis. It was already a complete human world in its own right, even if much about it remains difficult to understand. Its people lived near the sea, but they did not live as symbols. They farmed, stored goods, built rooms, made images, moved objects, and maintained relationships that archaeology can only partly recover. From the beginning of settled human life, every community has existed inside a balance between what it can control and what it cannot. People can build walls, gather harvests, organize labor, and teach children where they belong, but they cannot fully command the earth beneath them, the sea beside them, or the memory that later generations will make from their remains. This is why Santorini is so powerful as a comparison. A real volcanic event reminds us that nature can interrupt a society without becoming the whole explanation for that society's fate. A layer of ash can preserve a room, but it cannot preserve every voice. A ruined palace can show organization, but it cannot tell us every intention. A changed island can become part of memory, but memory is not the same as a direct record. If memories of Aegean disasters travelled across time, they may have helped create the atmosphere in which Atlantis could be imagined. That is a responsible possibility. It leaves room for influence without pretending to possess certainty. Plato, writing much later than the Bronze Age, may have inherited stories, patterns, or distant echoes of older losses. He may also have shaped familiar fears into a new form for his own philosophical purposes. Both possibilities can stand together. What cannot be said responsibly is that the case is closed. Atlantis remains first, a story in Plato's dialogues, and any historical comparison must begin from that fact. Santorini and the Minoans matter because they show that ancient island societies, sea power, and natural catastrophe were not imaginary. They belong to the real world around the eastern Mediterranean. Yet Atlantis, as Plato presents it, is not only about a place struck by disaster. It is about the moral fragility of power. It is about a society that becomes large enough to forget restraint. That theme cannot be excavated from ash alone. It belongs to the way humans turn history into warning. The real value of the Santorini hypothesis is not that it solves Atlantis, but that it teaches us how legends can grow near real events without being identical to them. A careful mind can hold resemblance without forcing identity. It can respect archaeology without making it serve fantasy. It can let Atlantis remain uncertain, while still learning from the true ancient worlds that may have helped make such a legend possible. Many real places have vanished without sinking in one dramatic moment. A city can disappear slowly, while people are still walking through its streets. Its harbour may fill with silt, its river may shift, its trade route may move to another coast. Its wells may weaken, its fields may lose value, its rulers may lose authority, and its young people may leave for places with better promise. After enough generations, the name remains, but the living system that made the place powerful is gone. This quieter kind of disappearance matters for Atlantis because it shows how memory can turn gradual loss into a sharper image. Plato's story gives us a sudden ending, but human communities often experience decline as a long narrowing of options. A port that once heard many languages may become a local shore. A market once crowded with goods may become a storage place, then an empty court, then a ruin. Later people may not remember each step. They may remember only the contrast. Once there was greatness, and then there was absence. Around the Mediterranean and other ancient seas, this pattern was common enough to shape imagination. Coastal settlements depended on water, but they also depended on the exact behavior of water. A harbour had to remain deep enough for ships. A river mouth had to remain useful. A coastline had to protect rather than expose. When these conditions changed, the city's body changed with them. Human life has always been tied to such practical limits. From the earliest communities near rivers, lakes and coasts, survival depended on reading landscape carefully. People needed to know where food gathered, where fresh water could be found, where storms came, and where movement was possible. When settlement grew larger, that old dependence did not disappear. It became more complex. Ships, warehouses, roads, taxes, temples, and laws all rested on the same basic truth. A society is never separate from its environment. If the place stops working, the society must change. This is where the origin of the Atlantis legend becomes easier to understand without forcing it into one site. The ancient world contained many examples of places whose importance faded. Some were damaged by earthquakes or floods. Some lost trade. Some were conquered. Some were abandoned slowly because the conditions that supported them no longer held. Each case left traces: pottery in the soil, broken walls, altered shorelines, old stories, names preserved after use had changed. These traces could enter memory in uneven ways. A merchant might remember that an old harbour was once rich. A family might repeat that their ancestors came from a ruined coast. A traveller might see stones under shallow water and imagine a larger loss. None of these memories had to be false, but none had to remain complete. Over time, scattered experiences could be gathered into a stronger tale. Atlantis may belong to that kind of gathering. It may not be the memory of one precise city, but an image built from many true human experiences of instability. This does not weaken the story, it makes it more human. People rarely remember decline as a spreadsheet of causes. They remember it as a shape. A place rose. A place became proud. A place was taken by water, war, time, or forgetfulness. The details become symbolic because the wound is larger than the record. In Plato's hands, that symbolic shape becomes philosophical. The lost city is no longer only a damaged settlement. It becomes a question about what any society depends on and how easily those supports can fail. Real vanished places teach us that disappearance is often less like a thunderclap than a lamp slowly losing oil, until later generations see only darkness and give it a name. When a place declines slowly, memory rarely keeps the decline slow. Later generations tend to compress time. What took centuries becomes a single fall. What involved trade, soil, weather, politics, inheritance, and migration becomes one clean sentence. A great place disappeared. This compression is not foolish. It is one of the ways human memory survives its own limits. No family can carry every shipment that failed to arrive, every season of poor harvest, every argument between rulers, every wall repaired after a storm, every younger person who left and did not return. Instead, memory gathers the long process into a shape that can be repeated. There was once a powerful place, and then it was gone. Atlantis has that shape. It is grander and more dramatic than ordinary decline, but it speaks to a real pattern in human history. Societies do not only vanish when the sea covers them, they vanish when their role in the world disappears. A harbour may still exist as water, but if ships stop coming, its meaning changes. A palace may still stand as stone, but if authority no longer gathers there, it becomes a shell. A road may still cross the land, but if trade has moved elsewhere, the road becomes memory under dust. In the life of one generation, these changes may feel confusing rather than legendary. People adapt. They repair. They hope conditions will return. They tell children that the old days were different. By the time those children become elders, the memory has already begun to simplify. This process reaches back to the earliest roots of human community. Long before writing, people needed to pass on knowledge that outlived direct experience. A dangerous water source, a valley where animals once gathered, a place where a group suffered hunger, a route that became unsafe. These did not remain as full records. They became warnings, names, gestures, and stories. Human memory was never only a storehouse, it was a tool for survival. As settlements grew larger and societies became more complex, the same tool began to carry larger losses. A village abandoned after drought, a town weakened after trade shifted, a coastal centre damaged by repeated storms, a kingdom remembered only through ruins. Later minds could not easily hold all the causes, so they held the feeling of disappearance. Atlantis can be understood within that long human habit. It gives one island the emotional weight of many vanishings. It turns a complex historical experience into an image that can be carried easily. Wealth, pride, catastrophe, silence. The danger is that the image becomes so strong that people mistake it for a solved event. But the image itself tells us something valuable. It shows how human beings remember power after power is gone. They often remember it through contrast. The stronger a place seemed, the more meaningful its absence becomes. A small settlement can be abandoned and nearly forgotten. A great centre leaves a wound in imagination. People ask why something so organised could fail. They look at broken walls and imagine full streets. They see a quiet shore and imagine crowded ships. They hear a name and fill the silence with a story. Plato's Atlantis works because it gives that silence a complete form. It does not ask the listener to study a slow decline in all its ordinary detail. It offers a world at full height, then removes it. That removal is dramatic, but the feeling beneath it is familiar to real history. Every generation inherits places whose original meanings are partly lost. Every society lives among traces it cannot fully explain. From the first human groups that learned to remember absent ancestors, empty camps, and old paths, people have understood that what is gone still shapes the living. Atlantis survives because it belongs to that deep structure of memory. It is not only a tale of a place beneath water. It is a tale of how human beings turn disappearance into a form simple enough to remember and serious enough to fear. Atlantis may be powerful because it does not behave like the memory of only one place. It behaves like a vessel large enough to hold many disappearances at once. A coast loses its harbour. An island is damaged by earthquake. A trading centre weakens when ships choose another route. A palace culture fades from political importance. A town is abandoned slowly, then remembered as if it vanished suddenly. None of these experiences alone has to be Atlantis. Together, they show why the idea of Atlantis could feel natural in the ancient imagination. Human beings often turn scattered losses into one clear image, because the mind needs shape where history leaves fragments. A single symbol can carry what many broken places cannot say separately. In this sense, Atlantis may be less like a hidden address, and more like a gathering point for memories of fragile civilization. That does not make it untrue in a useful sense. It makes it a story about the way truth can be changed when it passes through fear, time, and moral reflection. Archaeology works by separating layers, dates, materials, and contexts. Legend works by joining things that feel connected. The two should not be confused, yet they can speak near each other. Real vanished places give legend its gravity. Legend gives vanished places a form that ordinary memory can carry. From the beginning of human community, people have faced the problem of incomplete evidence. A campfire dies, but ash remains. A tool breaks, but the stone stays. A path disappears under grass, but an elder remembers where it ran. A burial mound remains after the name is gone. Human memory has always lived between what can be touched and what must be imagined. Atlantis grows in that middle space. It is built from the knowledge that human societies leave traces, but not complete explanations. The ancient Mediterranean made this knowledge visible everywhere. Old walls stood beside newer towns. Ruined places were folded into sacred stories. Names survived after languages shifted. Sailors carried reports that became larger as they moved. A person might hear of one damaged island, another fallen kingdom, another coast altered by water, and another city whose wealth had become a warning. Over time, these separate experiences could merge into a broader pattern. There was once a great power, it crossed the sea, it became unbalanced, and then it was removed from the ordinary world. Plato's Atlantis gives that pattern a disciplined literary form. It gathers loss into a story that can be examined. But because it gathers, it must not be narrowed too quickly. To demand one exact source may be to misunderstand how legends often begin. Some begin from one event. Others grow from a climate of memory, where many events share the same emotional weather. Atlantis may belong to the second kind. It may have roots in real coastal danger, real political anxiety, real ruined places, and real stories of disaster, without being identical to any single one of them. That possibility is humbler than the claim of discovery, but it is also more faithful to what we know. It respects the evidence without silencing the legend. It lets Santorini remain Santorini, Crete remain Crete, Plato remain Plato, and Atlantis remain the place where ancient fear, civic thought, and remembered loss meet. The lesson reaches beyond one sea. Every human society depends on conditions it does not fully control: land, water, food, trade, trust, memory, and time. When those conditions change, people do not only lose buildings, they lose the story that made those buildings feel secure. Atlantis is the image of that deeper loss. It is not merely about land beneath water. It is about the moment when many real vanishings are gathered into one quiet question. What remains of a civilization when its place, its power, and its living memory no longer stand together in the same human world? The attraction of Atlantis is not only that it is lost, it is that it is punished. In Plato's telling, the island is not destroyed while innocent, nor simply removed by a blind accident of nature. It becomes wealthy, ordered, and powerful, then loses the inner balance that once made its greatness seem noble. That movement gives the legend its moral gravity. A city ruined by earthquake can stir pity. A city ruined after arrogance stirs a more troubling feeling, because it asks where the collapse began before the ground shook. Atlantis is remembered as rich, but wealth alone is not its crime. Wealth becomes dangerous when it teaches a society to confuse possession with wisdom. The island's abundance makes expansion possible. Its ships carry force across water. Its rulers inherit power that begins as order and becomes appetite. The more Atlantis can reach, the more it seems to forget that reach is not the same as right. This is why the legend holds the attention of later generations. It speaks to a fear inside every organized society, the fear that success may train people to ignore the limits that allowed success to begin. Human communities have always needed limits. From the earliest groups that shared food, shelter, tools, and memory, survival depended on more than strength. It depended on restraint, not taking too much from a place, not breaking trust, not forgetting danger after safety. As societies grew larger, those limits became harder to feel. A village could see the field it depended on. A sea power could forget the people, winds, harvests, and distant shores that made its wealth possible. Atlantis gives that forgetting a visible form. The island is not merely large, it is swollen with confidence. Its power moves outward until the sea becomes an extension of desire. In Plato's moral imagination, that is where imbalance begins to show. The problem is not that humans build, trade, or rule. The problem is that power can make the world appear smaller than it is. It can make other people seem like obstacles. It can make old warnings sound childish. It can make a society believe that because it survived yesterday, it has mastered tomorrow. The idea of a punished empire remains compelling because history often shows a quieter version of the same pattern. Strong societies may weaken when institutions no longer serve common life, when wealth gathers without responsibility, when military reach becomes habit, or when leaders treat inherited order as entitlement. These are broad historical patterns, not a secret key to Atlantis. Plato shapes them into an island so the listener can contemplate them at a safe distance. The punished empire is a mirror, placed far enough away that the viewer may dare to look. That distance is important. Atlantis is outside the ordinary center of the Greek world, yet its moral problem is close. It lets the audience think about ambition without naming only one city. It lets them imagine excess without reducing the lesson to one political quarrel. The island's punishment is therefore not simple revenge. It is a narrative way of showing consequence. When a society loses measure, the world around it becomes unstable in meaning before it becomes unstable in stone. The sea that once carried its power finally becomes the image of its removal. The ground that supported its buildings no longer guarantees its future. The story's force comes from that reversal. What made Atlantis strong becomes inseparable from what makes it vanish. For people listening across centuries, this is more unsettling than a treasure map. It suggests that civilization is not lost only when walls fall. It may begin to be lost when abundance no longer produces gratitude, when order no longer produces humility, and when memory no longer restrains desire. Atlantis survives because it turns inward danger into one calm, unforgettable image. A great island empire, shining with achievement, already leaning towards silence before the waves arrive. One reason Atlantis has lived so long is that its pattern has appeared, in different forms, many times in human history. A society becomes strong, learns to organize people and resources across distance, and then faces a question that strength alone cannot answer. What should power be for? 1. If the answer becomes only more power, the structure begins to change from within. This does not mean every large society is doomed, or that history moves by a simple law of pride and punishment. Real decline is more complicated than a moral sentence. It may involve climate stress, food systems, trade routes, disease, war, debt, leadership, technology, population pressure, or the slow weakening of trust. But human beings often remember these tangled causes through a clearer shape. A city grows. A ruling class forgets limits. Wealth becomes display. Soldiers move farther than memory can follow. The center demands more from the edges. Then, when trouble comes, the society discovers that its greatness was not a single solid thing. It was a balance among fragile supports. Atlantis gives that balance a symbolic body. Its ships, wealth, and order make it impressive, yet those same things reveal how easily organization can become hunger. The story speaks because every generation has seen smaller versions of that change. A family can inherit land and forget the labor that preserved it. A town can prosper from trade and forget the landscape that made trade possible. A state can win power and forget the restraint that once justified its authority. The pattern reaches back toward the beginning of organized human life. Early communities survive not by strength alone, but by shared attention to food, weather, water, kinship, danger, and the memory of what had harmed people before. When groups became larger, the need for attention grew larger too, but the feeling of dependence could become less visible. A ruler far from the field may forget the field. A city far from the mine may forget the hands that brought metal from the ground. A fleet crossing distant water may forget the communities that supply its wood, grain, and sailors. Atlantis is powerful because it turns that forgetting into a place. Its downfall is not only the result of an external blow, it is the final image of a society that has stopped understanding the sources of its own life. This is why the legend should not be read only as punishment from above. It can also be read as consequence from within. When power expands faster than wisdom, the world becomes harder to hear. Warnings sound like weakness. Old limits look like obstacles. Other peoples become shadows at the edge of ambition. Such a society may still build carefully, count carefully, and rule efficiently. It may still appear disciplined from the outside, but the moral center has shifted. The tools of order now serve appetite. That is the quiet danger Plato gives to Atlantis. The island is not frightening because it is primitive or chaotic. It is frightening because it is advanced in the ordinary signs of civilization while becoming less capable of self-restraint. That warning is more serious than ruin. It says that the forms of civilization can remain standing while their purpose is already changing. Ancient listeners would not have needed modern terms to feel this. They knew cities could rise through courage and fall through excess. They knew victory could teach dangerous lessons. They knew wealth could soften memory. They knew the sea could make ambition look natural because every horizon invited another crossing. Atlantis gathers these recognitions into one empire and then lets the empire vanish. The value of the story lies in that gathering. It does not give a formula for history. It gives a shape for contemplation. When we hear of Atlantis, we are not only hearing about a possible lost island, we are hearing the old human fear that the powers built to protect a society may become the path by which that society begins to lose itself. Human beings remember lost civilizations not only because they are gone, but because they seem to ask something of the living. A ruin is never just old stone. It is a quiet comparison between what people once expected and what time allowed them to keep. Atlantis holds that comparison in a purified form. It gives us a society at the height of power, then lets that society become a warning after its disappearance. That is why the legend has remained stronger than many better documented places. It does not merely say that a city ended, it says that greatness itself can become dangerous when memory and restraint grow weak. Across history, people have often looked at vanished powers in this way. They see broken walls, abandoned ports, unread signs, or names preserved after daily life has disappeared, and they feel the old unease of inheritance. Someone built here. Someone trusted this place. Someone believed the future would continue through these stones. Then the living chain broke. That feeling reaches back to the earliest human experience of absence. Long before cities, people understood that a camp could be empty, a path could be lost, a familiar shelter could no longer protect, and a group that failed to remember danger might not return. As communities became larger, the same fear grew larger with them. Now the empty place was not only a camp, but a town, a palace, a harbour, or an empire. Atlantis turns that enlarged fear into one unforgettable example. It allows later listeners to imagine that a whole society can become a message left behind by its own failure. The power of such a warning lies in its distance. If a story names only one real city, listeners may argue about that city's politics, enemies, and accidents. If a story becomes a symbol, it can travel more widely. Atlantis is distant enough to belong to no single audience completely, but close enough in meaning to trouble many audiences. A Greek listener could hear a warning about naval ambition. A later reader could hear a warning about luxury. A modern listener may hear a warning about societies that mistake technical ability for wisdom. None of these readings proves a hidden Atlantis. They show why the legend keeps finding new homes in human thought. Lost civilizations are often remembered this way because they help the living think about their own fragility without looking directly at themselves. The past becomes safer to examine than the present. A vanished empire cannot answer back. Its silence lets people ask questions that would be difficult to ask about their own world. What makes order last? How much wealth can a society hold before it changes character? How quickly can confidence become blindness? Atlantis gathers these questions under the image of water, which makes the warning even deeper. Water covers. It blurs. It removes footprints, roads, and borders. It is the perfect image for the loss of evidence itself. A burned city leaves ash. A conquered city may leave records. A city beneath the sea becomes uncertain, half remembered and half imagined. That uncertainty is part of the spell, but also part of the lesson. Human beings want the past to stay available, yet the past is always partly withdrawn. The story of Atlantis reminds us that memory is not ownership. Even the strongest societies can be reduced to fragments, and even fragments can be reshaped by those who inherit them. This is why the legend should be approached with humility. Its value is not in proving that a perfect lost empire once waited beneath the waves. Its value is in showing how people use lost worlds to think about living ones. Atlantis survives because it gives form to a fear every society carries quietly, that the things built for permanence may one day become evidence of impermanence, and that the story told afterward may remember the warning more clearly than the people themselves. Atlantis keeps returning because it touches a quiet feeling many people carry about the past, the sense that something larger may have been lost before we arrived. This feeling is not the same as evidence. It does not prove a drowned empire, a hidden map, or a forgotten golden age, but it helps explain why the legend has survived so powerfully. Human beings do not only look backward to learn dates and names, they look backward to measure loss. The past feels wide because most of it is unreachable. Every generation inherits only fragments, a few texts, damaged buildings, scattered objects, old names, and stories whose first speakers are gone. Atlantis becomes a shape for that missing vastness. It imagines a place rich enough, ordered enough, and distant enough to stand for everything history may have taken beyond our reach. The attraction is not only curiosity, it is grief without a clear object. People sense that countless lives, languages, rituals, coastlines, houses, meals, songs, and fears have vanished without leaving full records. Atlantis gathers that absence into one island, and by doing so it gives the mind somewhere to place the weight of what cannot be recovered. From the earliest roots of Huganan life, memory has always been incomplete. A small group might remember a dead elder, an abandoned shelter, a path no longer safe, or a season when hunger changed everything. But even then, details faded. The human mind learned to preserve meaning after facts had thinned. Later, when societies built cities, ships, and archives, the scale of forgetting grew larger. Now, it was not only a family memory that could vanish, but whole ways of living. A buried room might survive while the voices in it disappeared completely. A harbour might remain on the coast while the names of the workers, sailors, and children who knew it were gone. This is where Atlantis becomes more than a mystery. It becomes an emotional instrument for thinking about historical silence. The legend says there was once a place of extraordinary reach, then it slipped away. That movement reflects a real human experience, even if the place itself remains unverified. We often feel that the world before us was fuller than the record allows us to see. Archaeology can recover tools, bones, walls, pollen, ash, shipwrecks, and inscriptions, but it cannot restore every ordinary morning. It cannot return every conversation at a doorway, every worry before a voyage, every child learning the shape of a familiar shore. Atlantis holds the ache created by that limit. It lets the lost past become visible as a single distant society. The danger is that this ache can be mistaken for proof. Because we feel that much has been lost, we may begin to believe that one perfect lost civilization must explain the feeling. A careful reading resists that step. The feeling is real, but its object may be symbolic. Atlantis may not be a missing continent. It may be a name for the way human memory suffers when history is larger than evidence. The legend's richness matters because it gives fullness to what is absent. Its disappearance matters because it admits that fullness can be removed. This is why stories of lost places are so soothing and unsettling at the same time. They slow the mind down. They let us sit beside loss without demanding that every question close. For the sleep listener, Atlantis can become a gentle meditation on time itself. Not a claim that the world once held a perfect hidden society, but a reminder that all human life rests on fragile transmission. What we know of the past is precious because so much did not survive. What we imagine must be held carefully because imagination can comfort, but it can also mislead. Atlantis remains powerful because it stands at that border between the true vastness of human loss and the human desire to give that loss a name. Lost places help human beings live with fears that are too large to hold directly. The fear of time is one of them. Time takes without violence. It removes voices, softens names, breaks memory into fragments, and leaves later generations standing beside remains they can touch but not fully understand. Atlantis gives that fear a shape. Instead of countless ordinary losses scattered across centuries, there is one island, one powerful society, one disappearance deep enough to gather the mind. The fear of the sea is another. Water is older than any city and indifferent to human intention. It can feed a harbour for generations, then change its boundary, swallow a shore, or carry away the signs by which people once knew themselves. For communities near coasts, this was not an abstract idea. The body knew it through storms, hunger, wreckage, damp walls, and the sound of waves at night. From the beginning of human life near rivers, lakes, and shorelines, water taught both dependence and caution. It gave food and movement, but it also demanded memory. A place that forgot the behavior of water could lose more than land. It could lose the continuity that made a group feel safe. Atlantis turns that ancient lesson into an image calm enough to contemplate. A great society stands beside the sea, grows through the sea, and then becomes unreachable through the sea. The legend also helps people face the fear of disaster. Disaster is frightening not only because it kills or destroys, but because it interrupts meaning. Before disaster, a house is a home, a road is a habit, a harbour is a promise, and a temple or public space may hold the memory of generations. After disaster, the same objects may become strange. A room without voices is no longer the same room. A street without return becomes a question. Human beings need stories to cross that gap between life and aftermath. A story does not repair the loss, but it gives the mind a path around it. Atlantis gives disaster a beginning, a moral pressure, and a silence afterward. That silence matters. It allows listeners to feel how fragile human order can be without being forced into panic. The fragility of society is perhaps the deepest fear beneath the legend. Every society depends on agreements that cannot be seen in stone alone. Trust, memory, habit, restraint, shared labour, and the belief that tomorrow will still recognise yesterday. These supports are biological as well as cultural. Human beings are social bodies. We need other people for food, protection, learning, childhood, care, and identity. From early human groups onward, survival was never only an individual achievement. It was held in relationships, repeated knowledge, and the steady transfer of attention from one generation to the next. Atlantis speaks to the fear that this transfer can break. When a society vanishes, what disappears is not only buildings. It is the chain of remembered meanings that made those buildings human. That is why lost places feel so powerful. They let us imagine social death without reducing it to personal death. They show a whole shared world passing beyond reach. Yet the legend does something gentle as well. It reminds us that fear can become reflection. The sea can be more than terror. Ruins can be more than evidence of failure. A vanished place can become a way to ask what should be protected while there is still time to protect it. It also teaches patience with uncertainty. The mind may want a simple answer, but older memory often arrives in layers, with some facts visible and others permanently gone. Atlantis does not need to be proven as a single site in order to serve that human purpose. It helps the living think about impermanence, not by shouting danger, but by placing a quiet island in the distance and letting its absence speak with patient force. The origin of Atlantis is not only a matter of one ancient text, it is also a matter of how human memory changes loss into image. Plato gave the legend its first secure written form, but the reason it kept living is deeper than authorship. A story survives when it finds a place inside the needs of later minds. Atlantis gives loss a body. It turns uncertainty into an island, power into architecture, fear into water, and disappearance into a scene that can be remembered. This is what memory often does when the past becomes too wide to hold directly. It selects, arranges, simplifies, and gives shape. Without shape, loss remains scattered. With shape, it can travel. A drowned island is easier to carry than thousands of ordinary endings. A language no longer spoken, a shore no longer inhabited, a family line broken, a harbour abandoned, a temple reused, a ruler forgotten, a road covered by dust. Atlantis gathers these separate forms of disappearance into one calm and haunting picture. That does not make the picture a direct record, it makes it a vessel. Human beings have always needed such vessels. From the earliest communities, memory had to move through fragile bodies and changing voices. A child learned where water could be found, where danger lived, which plants were useful, which places carried grief, which stories should not be forgotten. But each transfer changed the memory slightly. A warning became an image became a tale became an inheritance. Later societies added writing, temples, archives, laws and monuments, yet the deeper pattern remained the same. People still needed stories to hold what evidence could not fully preserve. Atlantis belongs to that pattern. Its origin lies partly in Plato's philosophical world, partly in the unstable landscapes of the Mediterranean, and partly in the human need to make absence visible. This is why the legend should not be treated as a simple mistake. A simple mistake dies when corrected. Atlantis did not die, because it was never only a claim about geography. It was also a way of thinking about what happens when memory loses the thing it remembers. A real city can leave stones, but stones do not speak completely. A disaster can leave ash, but ash does not explain every fear. A coast can change, but the people who once named its paths may vanish before their meanings are written down. In that silence, imagination enters. It can mislead if it pretends to be proof, but it can also reveal the emotional shape of what was lost. Atlantis reveals that shape with unusual force. It shows a world that appears organized, wealthy, and secure, then places that world beyond reach. The story teaches not by certainty, but by distance. It lets the listener feel that the past is real, yet never fully recoverable. It also reminds us that civilizations are not only made of buildings, They are made of remembered relationships between people and place. When those relationships break, the ruin that remains is only the outer shell of a deeper disappearance. This is why Atlantis continues to feel near, even while its location remains uncertain. Every generation lives beside some form of lost Atlantis. A homeland changed beyond recognition, an old community dissolved, a shoreline altered, an inherited story whose facts have thinned, a language or custom fading from daily use. The legend gives these quieter losses one visible horizon. It does not need to be a perfect historical report to show something true about human life. We remember by turning what is gone into something the mind can approach. We make images because the full past is too large, too broken, and too silent to hold all at once. Atlantis began in ancient words, but it endures because memory itself keeps building islands out of what it cannot recover. Atlantis became far more famous in the modern world because modern people changed the kind of question they asked. For many centuries, the story lived mainly as an ancient philosophical tale, a strange and memorable account from Plato about power, decline, and disappearance. Later readers still wondered about it, but the modern age gave that wondering new tools, new habits, and new temptations. Maps became more precise. Oceans were measured more carefully. Archaeology developed methods for uncovering buried cities, reading old layers and comparing material evidence. Geology began to explain how coasts move, how volcanoes erupt, how islands form, and how seas rise and fall over long spans of time. These changes made the world feel searchable. Once people believed the past could be recovered from ruins, it became easier to imagine Atlantis as a lost object waiting to be found. The legend shifted from moral story toward physical target. It was no longer only a warning about a powerful island society. It became, in many minds, a place that might be located by coordinates, matched to a coastline, or identified beneath water. That shift explains much of Atlantis's modern power. It entered an age that trusted discovery. The same age that uncovered ancient cities, decoded forgotten scripts, explored deep seas and mapped distant lands, also produced a stronger desire to turn every old mystery into a solved site. This desire is understandable. Human beings have always wanted the past to become touchable. From the earliest communities, people learned from traces left behind. A footprint in wet ground, a broken tool, an old hearth, a burial place, a path worn by earlier feet. To find a trace is to feel that absence has not completely won. Modern archaeology refined that ancient impulse into disciplined work. It showed that lost human worlds could sometimes be brought partly back into view. Cities once buried could be excavated. Languages once silent could sometimes be read again. Shipwrecks, walls, bones, seeds, ash and pottery could speak through patient study. Against that background, Atlantis became irresistible. If other lost places had been found, perhaps this one could be found too. Yet there is a quiet difference between a site that begins with material evidence and a legend that begins with a literary account. Archaeologists can search for places described in texts, but the text itself must be weighed carefully. Plato's Atlantis is not a broken inscription found beside a harbour. It is a crafted story placed inside dialogues concerned with political and moral questions. Modern enthusiasm often forgets that starting point. It moves too quickly from description to location, from resemblance to proof, from possibility to announcement. A circular landform becomes Atlantis. A submerged ruin becomes Atlantis. A volcanic island becomes Atlantis. A lost coastline becomes Atlantis. Each proposal may begin with a real feature worth studying, but the leap to Atlantis often outruns the evidence. This is where the modern story becomes less about Plato and more about the modern hunger for completion. We live in a world that expects mysteries to have final images. A documentary wants a reveal, a headline wants certainty, a map wants a point. But older memory does not always obey these forms. Atlantis became famous in the modern imagination because it sits exactly where evidence, desire, and silence meet. It promises a lost civilization, yet withholds confirmation. It sounds historical, yet moves like philosophy. It resembles real disasters, yet refuses to become one verified disaster. This unresolved quality made it available to books, lectures, television, films, internet claims, and endless speculation. The danger is not curiosity itself. Curiosity is the beginning of learning. The danger is when curiosity becomes impatient with uncertainty. The real story of Atlantis asks for the opposite habit. It asks us to see why modern people began hunting for it so intensely without confusing the hunt with the answer. The legend grew stronger when archaeology taught us that the buried past could sometimes return. But Atlantis also teaches that not every powerful story is waiting to become a place on a modern map. The modern search for Atlantis has always moved between three different habits of mind. The first is serious investigation, which begins with evidence and accepts limits. The second is cautious hypothesis, which notices resemblance but keeps uncertainty visible. The third is unverified claim, which begins with a desired answer and then gathers details around it. These may look similar from a distance, because all three can speak about ruins, old texts, ancient seas, and lost places. But they are not the same. Serious investigation asks what can be checked. It looks at the age of a site, the materials found there, the language of the text, the geology of the landscape, and the wider historical setting. It does not demand that evidence support a favourite story. If the evidence points away from the story must remain unproven. Cautious hypothesis is more open, but still disciplined. It may say that a volcanic eruption, a damaged island, or a vanished harbour could have influenced later memory. It may compare patterns, sea power, disaster, trade, political decline, and shifting shorelines, but it stops before certainty. It knows that resemblance is not identity. It knows that a real ancient place can help explain the atmosphere around a legend without becoming the legend itself. Unverified claims do something different. They often move too quickly. They take a circular shape in the ground, a submerged structure, an old map or a dramatic landscape, and they turn it into Atlantis before the harder questions have been answered. How old is it? Who lived there? What objects were found? Does the timeline fit Plato's text? Does the geography fit without forcing it? Are there independent lines of evidence? Or only a chain of attractive similarities? These questions matter because the past is fragile, and fragile things can be easily reshaped by desire. Human beings have always wanted signs to speak clearly. From the earliest communities, a mark in the earth, a broken tool, a path, a bone, or an old fire site could stir attention because traces meant presence. Someone had been there. Someone had acted. Someone had left a message without intending to. Modern research grows from that ancient attentiveness, but it adds method. It asks not only what a trace feels like, but what it can actually support. Atlantis tests that discipline because the legend is emotionally strong. It invites the mind to complete what evidence does not complete. A careful researcher resists that invitation. A careful listener should resist it too. This does not make the search dull. It makes it more respectful. A real ruined settlement is valuable even if it is not Atlantis. A real drowned harbour is valuable even if Plato never knew it. A real Bronze Age culture is valuable even if it cannot be turned into a perfect match for the legend. When every ancient place is treated only as a possible Atlantis, its own human story becomes smaller. The people who live there become props in a modern mystery. Their food, labour, trade, homes, fears, and generations are pushed aside so that one famous name can stand over them. That is not a fair way to handle the past. The honest approach lets each piece of evidence remain itself first. Then, only after that, it asks whether a cautious connection is possible. Atlantis is most useful when it teaches this difference. It shows how easily memory, hope, and evidence can be blended. It also shows why the strongest claim is not always the truest one. A loud theory may feel satisfying because it closes the gap. A quieter hypothesis may feel weaker because it leaves the question open. But in history, humility is often the stronger position. The real story of Atlantis is not served by declaring a discovery without enough support. It is served by understanding how a legend can grow near real ruins, real disasters, and real human fears, while still remaining a legend until evidence can carry more weight than imagination. Modern media can make Atlantis seem simpler than it is. A question becomes a location. A resemblance becomes a discovery. A theory becomes a headline before the evidence has had time to breathe. This happens because Atlantis carries unusual pressure. It has the beauty of an ancient text, the promise of a lost world, the drama of water, and the emotional pull of a civilization removed from sight. For books, films, documentaries, and online stories, that combination is powerful. It invites images before it invites caution. Blue depths, broken columns, hidden roads, circles seen from above, divers moving through silence, maps with one mark circled in red. These images are not wrong as art, but they can become misleading when they are treated as knowledge. The real story of Atlantis asks for a slower habit. It asks us to notice when language quietly changes. A responsible sentence may say that a site resembles one feature of Plato's account. A careless sentence may say that the site could be Atlantis. A more careless one may say that Atlantis has finally been found. Each step feels small, but together they move the listener away from evidence and towards certainty that has not been earned. Human beings are vulnerable to that movement because the mind likes completion. From the earliest roots of human memory, an unfinished trace has always invited explanation. A footprint needed a maker. A broken tool needed a hand. A strange ruin needed a builder. This instinct helped our ancestors read danger, presence, and absence in the world around them, but the same instinct can mislead when the trace is incomplete and the desired answer is strong. Atlantis is exactly that kind of case. The legend offers many details, but not the kind of independent archaeological trail that would allow one confident conclusion. Modern media often fills that gap with speed. It does not always have patience for uncertainty, because uncertainty is difficult to sell. A careful doubt is quieter than a dramatic announcement. A cautious comparison is less memorable than a claim of revelation. Yet history is damaged when it is forced to move at the speed of spectacle. A real ancient place deserves to be studied for what it is, not only for how easily it can be attached to a famous legend. A submerged structure may tell us about coastal change, trade, settlement, or geology. A Bronze Age ruin may tell us about labour, food, art, administration, and daily life. A volcanic island may tell us about the meeting of human settlement and natural force. If all of these are made to answer only one question, their own stories become thinner. Atlantis then stops helping us understand the past and begins to absorb the past into itself. That is one reason unverified claims can be harmful. They do not merely exaggerate, they can teach the listener to expect history to behave like a riddle with a hidden prize, instead of a patient study of people, places, and evidence. The origin of the Atlantis legend is more interesting than a quick reveal, because it shows how ancient writing, real environmental danger, political thought, and human longing can meet. That meeting cannot be reduced to one photograph or one map marker. It requires attention to Plato's purpose, to the Mediterranean world, to the memory of disasters, to the way societies fear decline, and to the modern desire for lost civilizations. When media turns the question into a conclusion too quickly, it removes the very thing that makes Atlantis valuable: its position at the border between what can be known and what must remain carefully imagined. The calmer path does not kill wonder. It protects wonder from becoming false certainty. It lets Atlantis remain a serious question, not because every claim is possible, but because the honest limits of knowledge are themselves part of the story. In that slower space, the legend can still speak, not as proof of a hidden empire, but as a reminder that human memory often reaches farther than evidence can safely follow. A truthful reading of Atlantis begins with balance. It does not require us to mock the legend, and it does not allow us to turn the legend into proven history. Both mistakes flatten the story. If Atlantis is dismissed too quickly, we lose the chance to understand why an ancient account could hold so much force for so long. If Atlantis is believed too quickly, we lose the discipline that protects the past from becoming whatever imagination wants it to be. The more careful path is quieter. It treats Plato's account as an important ancient story, shaped by philosophy, politics, memory, and the real fears of a sea-connected world. It asks what the story can responsibly tell us, and where it must stop. That stopping point is not failure, it is the boundary between learning and invention. Many old stories carry value without being literal records. A flood tale may preserve fear of water, memory of landscape change, or a warning about human limits, even when its details cannot be checked as a single event. A story of a fallen king may teach about power without giving us a complete court archive. A legend of a vanished place may reveal how people thought about loss, even when no exact site can be identified. Atlantis belongs in that wider family of meaningful stories. It may contain echoes of real disasters, real sea powers, real political anxieties, and real memories of ruined places. Yet an echo is not the same as a verified event. The responsible listener can hear the echo without pretending to know the original sound. This is how human memory has always needed to be handled. From the earliest communities, people passed on knowledge through speech, gesture, place, and repeated warning. They remembered where water could rise, where animals moved, where hunger had come, where trust had failed, and where ancestors had suffered. Those memories helped people live, but they were not perfect recordings. They changed as they moved. They became shaped by fear, hope, teaching, and the needs of the living. Later civilizations added writing, archives, monuments, and formal histories, but memory still remained human. It still selected, it still arranged. It still turned difficult events into forms that could be carried by later minds. Plato's Atlantis stands at that meeting place between remembered danger and crafted meaning. To respect it, we must not demand that it behave like a modern excavation report. We must also not let its age and beauty free it from questions. The real story asks for both sympathy and restraint. Sympathy lets us see why the legend mattered. Restraint prevents us from saying more than the evidence can hold. This balance is especially important because Atlantis has often been used as a container for claims far beyond Plato's text. Secret technologies, hidden global empires, lost perfect civilizations, or maps that reveal more than they can support. Such claims may sound exciting, but they move away from the sober value of the legend. They replace careful wonder with manufactured certainty. The older and deeper value of Atlantis is not that it gives us permission to believe anything. It teaches us how to stand near uncertainty without rushing to fill it. It shows how a society can be imagined through its abundance, its reach, its imbalance, and its disappearance. It shows how water, power, memory, and moral fear can join in one image. It also reminds us that the past is not protected by enthusiasm alone. The past needs patience. It needs attention to sources, context, and silence. It needs the humility to say that a story can be meaningful even when it is not confirmed as fact. For a long sleep journey through Atlantis, that humility is essential. It lets the legend remain alive without becoming dishonest. It lets the listener feel the weight of lost places, unstable seas, and fragile civilizations, while still knowing that not every beautiful image is evidence. The honest Atlantis is neither an empty fantasy nor a solved discovery. It is an ancient story whose value grows when we allow it to remain what it first securely is, a carefully shaped warning about power, memory, and the human temptation to mistake longing for proof. What can be said safely about Atlantis is already rich enough. It begins with Plato. The most important surviving source is not an inscription from a ruined harbour, not a ship's log, and not an excavation report, but a pair of philosophical dialogues written in ancient Athens. That starting point should guide every later sentence. Atlantis appears in a Greek intellectual world where stories could carry political thought, moral warning, inherited memory, and imagined example at the same time. It is linked with questions about the good city, the danger of excess, and the contrast between disciplined order and imperial appetite. These are secure observations because they come from the setting in which the story is preserved. It is also safe to say that the wider Mediterranean world made such a story understandable. The region was filled with islands, sea routes, volcanic landscapes, earthquakes, changing coasts, trading powers, and ruined places whose earlier meanings were not always clear to later generations. People who lived near that sea knew that water could connect a society to wealth and danger in the same movement. They knew that the ground could shake beneath temples, ports, houses, and memories. They knew that a city's strength could depend on harbours, grain, ships, alliances, and distances that no ruler fully controlled. These real conditions do not prove Atlantis as a particular location. but they help explain why a tale of a powerful island society destroyed after decline could carry weight. Human memory often forms itself around such conditions. From the earliest communities near rivers, coasts, and seasonal landscapes, people had to remember where life was possible and where danger could return. The body needed water, food, sleep, warmth, kinship, and protection, while the mind needed patterns that could be passed to children after direct witnesses were gone. Over long periods, memories of disaster or loss could become shaped stories. A flood might become a warning. A changed shoreline might become a vanished land. A broken city might become an example of pride. Atlantis belongs to that human process, even if its known form is literary and philosophical. It is safe to say that the legend may reflect ancient fears of natural disaster, especially in a world where earthquakes, volcanoes, and sea changes were part of lived reality. It is also safe to say that comparisons with places such as Santorini and the Minoan world are understandable because they involve real island societies, maritime exchange, and severe natural events. But understandable is not the same as proven. A responsible reading keeps these comparisons open and limited. It does not erase the Minoans by turning them into supporting actors for Atlantis. It does not turn Akrotiri into a solved answer because ash preserved a beautiful settlement. It does not force every drowned ruin or circular landform to serve a famous name. The evidence for those places should first tell their own story. Only then can they be placed gently beside Plato's account as possible influences, parallels, or reminders of the kinds of events that ancient people could remember and reshape. It is also safe to say that Atlantis has become a powerful symbol. It symbolizes the anxiety that wealth can weaken restraint, that sea power can become domination, and that societies may look permanent while depending on fragile supports. This symbolic value is not a lesser value. It may be the reason the story survived. A verified ruin teaches through objects. Atlantis teaches through a pattern. It shows abundance becoming imbalance, reach becoming appetite, and disappearance becoming memory. The honest reader can hold all of these safe claims without closing the mystery too quickly. Atlantis is a text, a warning, a mirror of Mediterranean fears, and a lasting image of lost human order. What it is not, at least on the evidence available, is a confirmed map to one vanished empire beneath the sea. A truthful reading of Atlantis also requires knowing what should not be said. The first unsafe claim is certainty about location. Many places have been proposed, from islands and coastlines to submerged formations and ancient settlements, but no proposal has carried enough evidence to identify one confirmed Atlantis. A resemblance is not a location. A circular shape is not a city. A ruin underwater is not automatically Plato's island. A volcanic disaster is not automatically the end of the story. The past is full of places that partly resemble one another, because human beings often built near water, traded by sea, suffered disasters, and left incomplete traces. To choose one place too quickly is to make the legend smaller and the evidence weaker. The second unsafe claim is certainty about a specific people. Plato's account does not allow us to name the Atlanteans as a verified population known from archaeology. We should not assign them a language, ethnicity, technology, daily routine, or biological identity as if these were established facts. That would turn a philosophical story into a false ethnography. Real ancient people deserve better than that. When archaeologists study a culture, they work from objects, layers, settlements, burials, food remains, tools, inscriptions, and patterns that can be compared. Atlantis does not give us that kind of independent material base. It gives us a literary image of a powerful society. The difference matters. From the earliest human communities, identity was never a decoration. It was carried in kinship, food, gesture, tools, land, memory, and the slow teaching of children. To invent a people without evidence is to invent the most intimate parts of human life. A careful story does not do that. The third unsafe claim is hidden technology. Atlantis has often been used as a home for ideas about advanced machines, secret energy, global navigation, or knowledge far beyond what the evidence supports. These claims may sound exciting, but they do not belong to a responsible reading of Plato. The ancient text speaks of wealth, power, buildings, metals, armies, rulers, and disaster. It does not provide verified evidence for a lost technological civilization beyond known ancient history. To add such things may create spectacle, but it moves away from the real question of where the legend came from. The fourth unsafe claim is a global lost empire. Atlantis in Plato is large and threatening, but it should not be stretched into a worldwide civilization that secretly shaped all ancient cultures. That kind of claim often weakens real history by taking achievements away from documented human societies and placing them under one imagined source. Pyramids, temples, cities, calendars, ships, and writing systems arose in different regions through long human labor, local environments, inherited skill, and many generations of trial. Human beings did not need a hidden Atlantis to become builders, sailors, farmers, rulers, artists, or storytellers. Our species already carried the biological and social capacities for learning across time. Hands able to shape material, brains able to remember patterns, voices able to teach, and communities able to preserve knowledge beyond one lifetime. The fifth unsafe claim is that the mystery has a final secret answer already known but hidden. Such claims usually replace evidence with suspicion. They suggest that absence of proof is itself proof of concealment. This is not a sound way to understand the past. The more honest position is simpler and stronger. Atlantis remains important because it is uncertain, because it stands between text and memory, because it reflects real fears without becoming a confirmed site. We can speak safely about Plato, Greek political thought, Mediterranean instability, ancient sea power, Santorini as a cautious comparison, and the human need to turn loss into story. We should not speak as if Atlantis has a fixed coordinate, a verified population, a secret technology, or a proven global role. The real story does not need those additions. It is already deep enough as a lesson in restraint, the same restraint that history asks from every generation that inherits fragments and wants them to become whole. Atlantis has lasted because it works like a mirror, not because it has been fixed to a map. When people look into it, they do not only see a possible lost island, they see their own anxiety about power, nature, and forgetting. Plato's story places a great society at a distance, beyond ordinary reach, so the listener can look at danger without feeling accused too directly. The island is wealthy, organized, and strong across the sea. It seems to possess the signs that human communities often associate with security: buildings, rulers, resources, roots, memory, and inherited order. Yet the story does not let those signs become comfort. It slowly turns them into questions. What happens when power grows beyond gratitude? What happens when a society remembers its victories more easily than its limits? What happens when the sea that made expansion possible also becomes the image of disappearance? These questions are not only Greek questions. They belong to the long human experience of building lives on unstable ground. From the earliest communities, people learned that survival required more than strength. A group had to remember where water changed, where food could fail, where conflict might return, where the dead were buried, and where children could be kept safe. Memory was not decoration, it was a shelter made of attention. As societies became larger, that shelter became more complicated. It had to hold laws, trade, inheritance, religion, political trust, and the stories that told people why their shared world mattered. Atlantis reflects the fear that this shelter can weaken from within. A society may still look large while its memory is becoming thin. It may still build while forgetting why it built. It may still command ships while losing the humility that once made command useful. The legend also mirrors fear of natural force. In Atlantis, the sea is not simply a background. It is the oldest presence in the story. Human beings can build beside water, travel on water, measure water, and depend on water, but they cannot make water care about their achievements. This is why the image of a vanished island is so enduring. It places human ambition beside something older than human ambition. The contrast is quiet and severe. A city may speak in laws, markets, ceremonies, and names, but the sea speaks by covering. It removes the difference between palace and road, between boundary and harbour, between the place where power was displayed and the place where ordinary people slept. Whether Atlantis was based on one event or many memories, this image expresses a real human knowledge. Nature does not need to hate a civilization in order to outlast it. That recognition has followed our species from small camps to great cities. The body needs ground that does not move too violently, water that does not rise too high, seasons that can be remembered, and other people who can be trusted when danger comes. Civilization never escapes those needs. It only builds higher forms around them. Atlantis becomes a mirror because it shows what happens when higher forms forget their lower roots. Under temples, fleets, courts, and wealth, there is still the fragile human body, still hunger, sleep, fear, childhood, aging, and dependence on the living world. The legend's final mirror is forgetting. A lost city is frightening, but a lost meaning is deeper. If Atlantis vanished, what vanished with it would not be stone alone. It would be names, gestures, habits, songs, meals, arguments, promises, and the small daily knowledge that made a society human. Plato's story has survived while its supposed place remains uncertain. That may be the most important mirror of all. Sometimes memory does not preserve the world itself. It preserves the question the world left behind, and asks each later generation to look at its own foundations more gently, before certainty turns into another form of sleep, pride, and quiet forgetting. The educational value of Atlantis begins with a simple discipline, learning to tell the difference between evidence, memory, symbol, and desire. These four things often stand close together, but they do not carry the same weight. Evidence is what can be examined, compared, dated, questioned, and placed beside other evidence. It may be a text, a wall, a tool, a layer of ash, a harbour, a bone, a seed, or an inscription. Evidence does not always speak clearly, but it asks to be treated carefully. Memory is different. Memory can preserve something real, yet it changes as it travels. A story repeated across generations may hold the feeling of a flood, the fear of a broken coast, or the warning of a fallen city, even when many details have shifted. Symbol is different again. A symbol does not have to be a direct record in order to carry truth. Atlantis can symbolize unstable power, human pride, the danger of forgetting limits, and the way the sea can become an image for everything history has covered. Desire is the most dangerous of the four, because desire often wants the other three to obey it. Desire wants Atlantis to be found. Desire wants the mystery to close. Desire wants a hidden map, a perfect ruin, a single answer that makes the past feel complete. The honest mind does not reject desire with anger. It simply learns not to let desire become proof. This lesson is useful far beyond Atlantis. Human beings have always lived by interpreting signs. From the earliest communities, a footprint, a broken branch, a change in water, a cry in the dark, or an old mark on stone could matter for survival. The human brain became skilled at connecting fragments because fragments could mean danger, food, shelter, or the presence of other people. That ability helped our species endure. But the same ability can also lead us too far. We may connect things that only resemble each other. We may create a pattern because the emptiness feels uncomfortable. We may prefer a beautiful explanation over a cautious one. Atlantis teaches this gently, because the legend is beautiful enough to tempt us and uncertain enough to slow us down. It invites curiosity, but it also asks for patience. A careful listener can say that Plato is the main surviving source, that the Mediterranean world knew earthquakes, volcanoes, sea roots, and ruined places, that the Minoan world and Santorini are meaningful comparisons, and that stories of lost societies often grow near real experiences of loss. The same listener can also refuse to say that Atlantis has a confirmed location, a verified population, a secret technology, or a proven identity with one known culture. That refusal is not a loss of wonder. It is the beginning of respect. Respect for the ancient text, respect for archaeology, respect for the real peoples of the past, whose lives should not be swallowed by a modern hunger for mystery. When every ruin is forced to become Atlantis, the actual people who built that ruin become less visible. Their meals, tools, work, children, fears, songs, and ordinary days are pushed behind a famous name. A more honest approach gives them back their own place in history. Atlantis can still remain powerful, but it no longer steals the identity of every ancient trace. This is the deeper educational message. The past is not ours to reshape without limits. It is something we receive in fragments, and those fragments ask for humility. Some questions can be answered, some can only be narrowed. Some must remain open because the evidence is not strong enough to carry certainty. In a world full of fast claims and dramatic conclusions, Atlantis teaches a slower kind of thinking. It teaches that a story can be meaningful without being proven as fact. It teaches that uncertainty is not emptiness. It teaches that wonder becomes more valuable when it is protected by honesty. And perhaps, quietly, it teaches that the way we handle old stories reveals something about the way we handle our own time, our own power, and our own need to believe. Atlantis may not have survived as a place, but it has survived as a question. That may be why the legend is still with us after so many centuries. A confirmed ruin can be measured, photographed, catalogued, and placed inside a museum record. A question moves differently. It enters new minds, changes shape, and waits beside each age's own uncertainty. Plato's story began in an ancient conversation about power, order, and decline. Later generations carried it into maps, books, expeditions, arguments, and dreams of discovery. Some searched the sea, some searched old ruins, some searched the story itself. Yet the most durable thing was not a coordinate. It was the feeling that a society can become great, can seem secure, can fill the mind with images of wealth and order, and still pass beyond reach. That feeling is not proof of a drowned empire. It is proof of something quieter. Human beings know that what they build can disappear, and that disappearance often leaves meaning behind even when certainty is gone. From the earliest roots of our species, people lived by passing memory forward. A child learned where water was safe, where food could be found, where danger had come before, which names mattered, which dead should be remembered, and which warnings belonged to the land. Those lessons helped groups survive, but they were never perfect. Memory always thinned. Time always took more than it returned. Later, when humans built cities, ships, laws, temples, trade routes, and archives, they did not escape that older fragility. They only made the fragile thing larger. Now a society could lose not only a camp or a path, but a whole shared world of meanings. Atlantis stands at the edge of that loss. It reminds us that civilization is not a permanent object. It is a living agreement between bodies, places, food, trust, memory, and restraint. When those bonds weaken, buildings may remain for a while, but the world that made them human may already be fading. That is the sober value of the legend. It teaches us not to confuse grandeur with safety. It teaches us not to confuse old words with verified facts. It teaches us not to let our desire for mystery erase the real ancient peoples whose traces deserve their own careful attention. A ruined harbour should first be allowed to be itself. A Bronze Age settlement should first be allowed to tell its own story through evidence. A philosophical tale should first be understood in the world that shaped it. Only after that can imagination approach without doing harm. Atlantis is valuable because it asks for both wonder and restraint. Wonder keeps the past alive. Restraint keeps the past honest. Without wonder, history becomes a list of objects. Without restraint, history becomes a dream pretending to be knowledge. The real story of Atlantis lives between those two dangers. It invites us to listen to Plato, to the Mediterranean Sea, to earthquakes and changed coasts, to memories of lost places, and to the human longing for a past more complete than the evidence allows. It also invites us to accept that some questions are not made smaller by remaining open. They become more useful because they teach us how to live with the limits of knowing. In the end, Atlantis may be less important as a missing city than as a lasting test of human memory. It asks whether we can love a mystery without making it false. It asks whether we can honour ancient loss without inventing what we wish had survived. And after all the maps, ruins, theories, warnings and silences, the legend leaves us with one final question that remains quiet enough for the dark. If Atlantis still lives after more than 2,000 years, what truly survived, a city beneath the sea, or the human need to give a name to what history has taken away?